it is important to theorize and look at the practices of the state in order to understand the political context in history, which you call the continuity of how the state deals with its citizens, especially the citizens at its margins.
For many of the secular liberals, etc., the right-wing Hindutva might be an anathema. But at the same time, let us see that how it has seeped in, how it has existed in the Indian nationalist history itself.
The way certain historians have studied communal violence in the colonial era, they did view of the state as a potential actor in the violence. But post-colonial or in the independent era, while we study or while historians have tried to study communal violence per se, they have focused it on the two communities or two or more communities that might have been at odds with each other. But the state has been, in your words, exonerated from all complicity.
And if we actually see Blom-Hansen's this conceptualization of the state in terms of sublime and profane functions, the institution of a commission of inquiry is usually seen or can be said to be an attempt by the state to rebuild its lost legitimacy.
But when we look at the Indian state's treatment of the Muslims as a community, we see that the process of treating them differently has not been recent, and in fact it goes very long back. In your own book, you have written about the 1950s government order that excluded Muslims and Christians.
We had identified, when I was with such a committee, at least 30 different communities within UP itself which had not been given the status of OBC despite being, by all parameters, a backward caste or backward community from amongst Muslims.
Now, you in your book say that there are three ways that we can study communal violence. One of them is through nationalist historiographies, one of them is through subaltern historiographies, and one is through Marxist historiographies. Can you explain what are the differences that you observe while you study each of these? Welcome to another episode of Nous Interviews. As you might have seen in our previous editions, we try to bring to you perspectives, worldviews, and information from all across the world. In the latest edition of Nous Interviews, we are here to discuss very deep questions about what is a state, how does it interact with its citizens, how does it interact with citizens on its margins, especially minorities such as Muslims, and how are these interactions taking place in terms of law, in terms of judiciary, in terms of police, and in terms of our popular imagination. To do all of these discussions, we have a very special guest with us today. Please welcome Professor Tanweer Fazal Sahab. Tanweer Fazal Sahab is a professor of sociology at the University of Hyderabad. He also used to teach at the Center for Study of Social Systems at Jawaharlal Nehru University and at the Nelson Mandela Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution at Jamia Millia Islamia. He is an expert in history and politics and has written countless papers and edited a number of volumes regarding Muslims, regarding minority rights, and regarding the interaction between Muslims, minorities, and the nation state. Professor Fazal, thank you so much for coming here. So, Professor Fazal, this discussion, this interview that we have today is primarily about your latest book. And as you can see, I have read quite a bit of it.
Yes, it is very evident.
So, it's the practices of the state, Muslims, law, and violence in India. Now, this book goes through a number of themes which are all interconnected, as you yourself wrote in the introduction. They're on diverse issues. They're on issues of reservation. They are on issues of cow vigilantism. They're on issues of how the law is interpreted and how the law is executed by the judiciary. So, I wanted to ask at the very beginning, in terms of when you began to write this book and in terms of what you see right now, what made you put pen to paper? Why did you write this book?
Well, I also write this in the acknowledgement that this book actually is it came out of a sort of a anger and frustration, which I started developing since last, you can say, 10 years. particularly with the turn of things as it happened since 2014. This book recognizes that 2014 is a rupture in the Indian political history in certain sense. It doesn't say that this is something which has happened first time, that a right-wing government came to power. It has had its flirtations with power at the center as well, earlier too. But what remarkably changed this time was the way in which it was able to galvanize the term which I use in the book is the national public. The galvanized the national public and largely built, in my understanding, on the basis of hate. Some people might say that, oh, it was not such a thing as such. The previous government was facing many kinds of scandals. There were issues about corruption, etc. But nevertheless, 2014 and then 2019 further proves that point. And the series of actions of the government itself certifies what I'm trying to build, is that this new kind of a character of the state which we were witnessing was certainly different from all earlier ones. But at the same time, I also want to say that it is not that there is no continuity with the past. So one of the things which in the introduction itself I try to address is this question, that what for many of the secular liberals, etc., the right-wing Hindutva might be an anathema. But at the same time, let us see that how it has seeped in, how it has existed in the Indian nationalist history itself. If we go back to our national movement and see a very definite tilt towards majoritarianism which existed on some very critical questions. And each of these questions which I address in this book, whether it is a question about the people being termed as foreigners and driven away, or attempts being made to drive them away from the Indian territorial areas. This is the whole question of immigration and foreigners, etc., in Assam. Or whether you take a question as innocuous as the question about, the cattle and cattle protection, anti-cow slaughter bills, etc. All of them have also had their past. In particularly those moments, which are also at the same time the glorious moments of Indian secular history. How did they survive? How did they emerge in those contexts? And it is not that they remain only on the margins, but they did acquire certain kind of central stage. When I'm talking about, the anti-slaughter acts, they have the histories in the 1950s and 60s. Similarly, many of the anti-conversion laws, which actually, interestingly, they're called, most of them are referred to as Freedom of Religion Act or something like that. But they're actually unfreedom acts. They try to, the choice about making certain religious systems as your option, it seriously makes certain kind of a impediment on that.
So to begin with where this discussion began, it is important to theorize and look at the practices of the state in order to understand the political context in history, which you call the continuity of how the state deals with its citizens, especially the citizens at its margins. So can you tell us about the theories of states that you've used to analyze the nation state of India, especially something that you quote, the strong weak state that we have?
So strong weak state, this concept is used by Rudolphs and Rudolphs. Their political economy perspective from which they have tried to understand the state. And their frame is from the beginning of the inauguration of the Republic and up till 1980s or so. So the recent ways in which the state has behaved, the new kinds of class forces which have come to impact the state, that remains out of their purview as such. But when they were trying to argue about the state, they were trying to suggest that how the state in some situations has been able to address certain questions of social inequality, etc. But in other situations, it has failed and it has actually succumbed to those who are considered to be dominant and oppressing classes, where it has failed to really, ensure that its authority worked effectively as it should have. I take that thing further to try to understand that how the state, which is supposed to or claims itself, see the fundamental claim which the modern state makes is that how, although it serves the interests of the citizenry, but at the same time it is above the competing interests which exist within the society, and it thus would behave and promises that it would act in a neutral fashion. It will ensure justice, and particularly justice to those who need it. Now, if we examine the Indian state and its practices up till now, there is a claim and what is the reality. And that is what I try to understand. And the title of the book also is Practices of the State for this particular reason.
It's true.
Also, because I use this, a new kind of an anthropological turn in the study of the state, where the anthropologist just is more interested in understanding the behavioral pattern of the state. So the theories do exist, but how is it constructed, or how is it experienced by the ordinary citizenry or different classes of the citizenry? In this context, I was particularly impressed, and I have used this conceptualization by Thomas Blom Hansen, where he makes a distinction between the sublime and profane functions of the state, or sublime and profane constructions of the state in the eyes of the people who experience it. Blom Hansen studied Mumbai riots and develops this concept from that particular study. But you can take it further into other situations too, and see that how various different episodes of collective violence post 1947, even the 1947 partition riots, have hardly been really investigated, anyone prosecuted, although millions perished. So there is what remains one of the dark chapters of Indian states dealing with issues of collective violence, is this whole thing about impunity. We do talk about it in everyday discussions, but hardly there has been any considered study on it. How is this impunity produced? How do, despite all institutions being in place, despite the justice mechanism being in place, the law enforcing mechanism being in place, the political authority being in place, and still violence after violence, and there are multiple such instances, and you hardly see any such situation in which perpetrators have really been brought to book. How is this impunity produced? And for me, this case study was the case of Bhagalpur riots 1989, which began when the present day BJP and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad started a campaign to build the Ram Mandir at Ayodhya, and they would carry a brick from every village. These processions would finally reach the district headquarters and gather into a massive procession. So one thing led to another, and this triggered violence, which ended up in the killing of officially 900, but it is said that more than 2,000 people were killed. The riots continued for 2 months or so. But Bhagalpur riots is also an interesting thing in the sense the way in which the commission of inquiry which was instituted, came out with its report. I would just want to say a bit about the commission of inquiry. That
Please go
every violence is in India, interestingly, followed by a commission of inquiry. And if we actually see Blom-Hansen's this conceptualization of the state in terms of sublime and profane functions, the institution of a commission of inquiry is usually seen or can be said to be an attempt by the state to rebuild its lost legitimacy. And however, none of the commissions of inquiry and their reports have actually been implemented. Take any case as such. Same happened with Bhagalpur case too, but the Bhagalpur case, there were same commission with same exhibits, same evidences, same witnesses, and same depositions, yet came up with two different reports altogether, completely different in terms of the conclusions. I went into the mechanism of how truth is produced and how this process of the production of official truth is part and parcel of what we call as the whole exercise through which perpetrators are able to escape. The perpetrators are never brought to book, that impunity prevails. This is just one part of it. We also know, we are also aware about, and if you go into the details of any riot situation, you'll see that how people who are affected are find it so difficult to file FIRs. The first step which is there, FIRs are delayed, which later on becomes a subject on the basis of which justice mechanism is affected in the courts. FIRs are filed against unknown people. Also, many times spellings are misspelled. As a result, the actual perpetrator is never caught. So there are various ways in which it works. In the case of Bhagalpur too, because of all these things, 3/4 of the cases of violence were actually never investigated, no one was prosecuted. So that is again an important and serious field of inquiry for social scientists interested in understanding violence.
There were a lot of points there which I will come back to, especially the point about the official production of truth or the way the state enjoys a certain impunity. We'll come back to them. I'll first begin with a rather basic question. So you've talked about how the practices of the state are not what they claim to be usually, what the state claims to have as its ideals or as its objectives. So Agamben noted down that there were certain exceptions at a time when the state, such as during an environmental disaster, such as during a certain state of emergency, or such as when there were imminent majoritarian populist feelings, that the state felt that they now were exempt from their certain rigidity and could act very freely. And it's usually in those times when the state wants to act freely that we see that they utilize laws and they utilize legality as a whole to impose violence and to inflict vengeance, basically, or to seek revenge. How do you feel that these elements of exceptions or these times of emergencies are created in order to give the state the opportunity to impose violence?
See, I have a bit of a difference from Agamben, of course, on this question. Agamben's theory is about the state of exception. And you rightly said that it is situations of extreme violence or certain kind of emergency, environmental crisis, or something when the state takes upon itself the role of taking an exceptional kind of a role, wherein the existing laws it is able to override bypass them, override them, on the plea that this is an exceptional situation. But however, my argument is that even the routine, everyday work of the state, when it's see in terms of, and my whole lens is focused at the behavior of the Indian state as such. So if we look at its routine and everyday practice too, it doesn't wait for an exception.
True.
When it comes to how the margin experiences the state, look at the slum dwellers and the amount of disproportionate violence that comes from them. Even recently in UP, we have heard that in Akbar Nagar, a locality which was in existence for the last 50 years or so, was razed to the ground in no time. Similarly, various different classes of citizens who have also, despite this promise of citizenship, have really not been able to enjoy the fruits of citizenship, have to face this brunt of the state as a routine form of violence. So, exception is not it depends on how we understand that situation, and from what standpoint are we looking towards the state as and its actions. If I'm sitting in a slum and experiencing the state in every day, I don't see that the state behaves in such a way only in exception. It waits for an exceptional situation. So that is where I think that we should also look at the practices of the state in normal times and not exceptional times only.
That's very fair. So, since we have been talking about the practices of the state and the theory about it, we see that the state reacts in a very disproportionate manner to the people in the margins, to the people that we or somebody else might call the other. So now I'll enter the territory of the first chapter that you've written in the book. It's about the NRC exercise in Assam. And the very striking feature that I found out when I was reading about it was how almost every person who was on the margins in Assam was tried to be vilified by one or the other epithet given to them, whether it be Bangladeshi, whether it be Mia, whether it be anything of that sort. And as you talked about the official production of truth, I did want to talk about the epistemological production of the other that you talk about in your first chapter with regards to the NRC exercise in Assam. So could you talk to us?
See, the NRC exercise, many of us are now familiar with it. In 2019, the final NRC report came out, and which ended up, taking away the citizenship of around 1.9 million people. This is 20 lakh people or so. It's not a small number. And despite that, you will hardly see, except for, of course, there was a huge protest after the CAA, which followed NRC, was enacted. And there was huge protest all across. And that protests also led to, certain kind of a marginalization and, certain amount of violence which the minorities had to face. Say the case of violence in Delhi, in UP, where the police killed 23 people or so, the protesters, even in places such as Karnataka, etc. Now, when we're talking about NRC, I was interested in understanding that all through this thing, the justification for the NRC in Assam, both from the secular camp as well as the right-wing camp, was about the justification came on the basis that Assam was being inundated by continuous flow of immigration from Bangladesh. And this flow particularly increased hugely since 1971, when the Bangladesh was formed. And therefore, particularly the Assam movement those associated with the Assam movement, or intellectuals aligned with the such kind of a view, they had been arguing for some kind of a method through which citizens could be identified, and those who were foreigners, then further step could be taken, maybe pushed back. Now, if we look at the case of in Assam, the history is very interesting and very turbulent as well. What we know of today's Assam is formed of also a part of Barak Valley, which is largely Bengali speaking. This was a Bengali speaking region which was brought together with Assam through a colonial rearrangement of provinces, etc. And hence it was always a Bengali area. Then around in the colonial time itself, Bengali speaking population, in this time Muslims largely, were encouraged to move towards the Brahmaputra Valley of Assam, particularly to fill the needs of the landlords of Assam, who required those who could work in the lands. And these were very good farmers and peasants. They really worked hard, settled there, and they have settled there for more than 100, 150 years. These are the people who are called as Na Assamia, and they return themselves as Assamese. They send their children, many of them, to the Assamese medium school. And in the census too, Assamese became a majority language in Assam because this section of population started returning themselves as Assamese speaking. Now, despite their effort to assimilate with the Assamese population and adopt Assamese culture, they continue to be otherized. So when we talk about Bangladeshis in Assam, and when certain intellectuals say this, it is a 40 million, 30 million, 10 million, etc., all these Bengali speaking populations are included within that. That is the first flaw and first mischief which is done. The second problem is that there is an argument that since 1971 at least, this flow has increased rapidly, and Assam's culture, Assam's land, all are in danger of being taken over. I examined the census data, and in fact, since 1971, when there should have been a rise in the rate of growth of population in Assam, if the immigration theory was to be accepted, the reverse had happened. There was actually a decline of population rate of growth in Assam. And there is no explanation for it. The theory about continuous immigration lives side by side with this census data, which completely gives a different figure altogether. And therefore, I think when I argue about this epistemological production of the foreigner, there's a whole exercise, intellectual exercise, apart from the official exercise, which can be seen and observed. Assam, there have been multiple laws too, which have been, enacted from time to time, from the 1960s onwards, to check, immigrants and in the 60s there was a PIP kind of a scheme of the Assam police, border police, wherein immigrants were identified and pushed back. So there have been a continuous kind of a process, legal mechanism, police action, which has visited these populations. And despite all these checks and mechanisms, they continue to be isolated, continue to be otherized, and pushed into detention camps, termed as D voters. This is a category which doesn't exist anywhere else in India, but only in Assam. The CA movement rose because it feared that the same thing would visit us in the rest of the country as well, as it was being faced by the Bengali-speaking population of Assam. So the chapter actually addresses that question. And in fact, it argues that how intellectuals also have played a role in this identification and categorization of foreigners in Assam.
Thank you for answering that question. And you're absolutely right. It's when we talk about knowledge production, it has to happen on multiple levels. So obviously, the intellectual class is also complicit in that. And I'm glad you mentioned the CEA protests as well, because that will also feature in this interview a couple of times. But the one thing that I did want to ask was, in the book itself, you mention the concept of jus soli and jus sanguine while talking about the issues of citizenship. So, could you explain to us what those concepts are, and especially how important they are in context of the Indian nation state's promise to its citizens?
So, we have been told to believe all through that the foundations of the Indian nation state is a secular republic kind of an idea. Although the word secularism was placed later, but Indian nationalism also always was built around this idea of being a secular nationalist movement. And it followed that the Indian Citizenship Act too had no such a kind of ethnic or cultural markers to identify citizens. In some countries, it is there. Say for example, in Germany, it is far more easier for you to get a German citizenship if you are from some kind of a German past.
Or in Israel, I believe.
In Israel, there is a law of return, which is an extreme case, that you just have to be a Jewish, irrespective of what ethnic origin you are. And whereas those who are actually the original residents would be excluded, the Arabs there. Nevertheless, Indian Citizenship Act of 1955 does not adhere to any kind of an ethnic or cultural kind of a association. There was a debate then, of course, that within the Constituent Assembly too, some of the members were asking that Hindus and Sikhs living wherever in the world for them it should be made easier to get the Indian citizenship. Nevertheless, despite all these debates being there, what was resolved was that this idea about jus solis, the right of soil. So all those who are residents of India have the right to have the Indian citizenship. And a certain date was identified that from this day onwards, whoever has lived in India would be a citizen of India. There are certain other 2 or 3 other ways through which you can acquire Indian citizenship, but none of them refer to any religion or ethnic criteria. However, when we come to the CAA, it compromises that secular promise of the Indian Constitution. It makes the first breach it makes a breach in the Indian Citizenship Act itself by including religious criteria. As we know, that except for the Muslims, it particularly accepts Muslims or practitioners of Islam from the neighboring countries to acquire Indian citizenship, because it believes that religious persecution is faced by the non-Muslims in our neighboring countries and not Muslims as such. There are many flaws in this argument. I don't want to go further into it, but what it does do is that it creates classes of citizens on the basis of their religious affiliation. The fear is that if this principle, once accepted, once legitimated, it would lead to this principle of jus sanguine being accepted in the Indian citizenship theory, which would end up making first or second class citizens. And this more or less goes along with what the founders of RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha had always.
And just to clarify, jus sanguini is citizenship by bloodline.
By bloodline, which means basically ethnic association, etc. So this, in one way or the other, conforms with the idea of citizenship and nationalism, which was forwarded by Savarkar or Guru Golwalkar and others, but not accepted in the Indian Constituent Assembly.
Now, coming to the ways that Muslims in the margins experience the nation state. Recently in the news, there has been multiple cases of lynchings related to beef eating, related to cow-related violence. And that is also very pertinent as the next chapter of your book, The Sacred Cow. So, I do want to ask you, if you can enlighten us, about what is the history of cow politics in terms of the Indian nation state? And I'll then ask a further question about the laws related to it.
I somewhere in the chapter I also call it as cow nationalism.
Oh, nice.
Now, you see, this is another similar kind of context in which we examine the relationship between state, the Muslim, or the margin, and the national public. Here, I would also like to clarify that when I am talking about Muslims as such, I don't see them, unless someone, before anyone comes to blame me for that, I don't see Muslims as monolith. In fact, in the book also, we refer to them as a collective of collectivities, a collective of communities, rather than being a singular community. And therefore, there are classes of Muslims, there are different castes of Muslims, there's different social statuses, there are Muslims in different regions and ethnic origins. I argue that to the extent that what we see as Muslim and what we refer to as Muslim is more externally produced than internally experienced. By externally produced, I mean that at the cross section of the state, the national public, etc., and the way in which this whole idea of who is a Muslim and how does Muslim behave, most often, through pejorative or derogatory kind of constructions. But nevertheless, this whole Muslimness is more externally produced than internally experienced, in the sense that internally Muslims see themselves into various different kinds of observances and practices. Shias, Sunnis, Barelvis, and Deobandis, and many times intense conflict and debate amongst them. Besides, of course, the hierarchies which exist. Now, if you observe, this book actually addresses in all these different contexts of violence and of different kinds which it tries to record, that it is the most ordinary Muslim and his or her question, and the way in which he or she is affected is the concern of the book. We are not concerned about the Raja of Mahmudabad losing his enemy property under the Enemy Property Act. We are not concerned about, in this book at least, about high politics of Muslim elite as such. But when he refers to this whole question of cow nationalism, who are the people who are affected most? Today, the Prime Minister of India, in his speech after speech, was trying to say that we have to reach out to the Pasmanda Muslims. These are the people who are the most affected. The cow trade or the cattle trade, including cattle rearing, as in the Nous of Mewat, or in many other places, the Muslim peasantry also rears cattle. Then there are also those Muslims who are involved in the trade. There are those Muslims who are also involved in the flesh and the sale of flesh. There are a huge number of livelihoods which are dependent on them. And with one stroke of law, when they try to, such as the Maharashtra Act, in one stroke, they try to completely banish all forms of you know, uh, slaughters of cattle. It affected in hugely a large number of those who were dependent in terms of livelihood. Now, we should also be aware that it is not only a Muslim question. Good number of the Dalits and the tribals are also dependent on cattle rearing as well as eating. In the entire Northeast, it is a sort of a food which is also relished along with other kind of meat. Now, what has happened is that through this in this chapter, I try to examine the states and its practices in three different junctures. One is the colonial period, and what was the uh, colonial states' immediate concern when it dealt with issues such as this, which were potentially explosive. The first thing which we see is that and this is evident also in the case of, say, the Ayodhya issue. That the colonial state felt that maintaining the status quo is more, effective way of ensuring public order than actually disturbing it. And hence, even on these questions about cow slaughter, etc., there were some limitations put, but at the same time, the public order remained the first concern. And so restrictions were placed to ensure that it is not done publicly, that there are cattle of a certain age, which are particularly overaged and not milk producing anymore, for instance, could could end up in slaughterhouses and other places. When it comes to the independent India, there is a new, kind of a mobilization around cow slaughter and demands of banning it altogether. And we see Article 48, which enters in the Indian constitution as a directive principle, because India claimed itself to be a secular state. So therefore, it takes a rational logic for prohibiting it, but arguing that it is for the maintenance of animal husbandry and hybrid of cattle, etc., that restrictions should be placed on their slaughter. This cover of rationality and scientific ideas about cattle rearing, etc., is no longer an issue now when it comes to 2014 onwards. We have the cow protection law being changed in Haryana, the law being changed in Gujarat, and all these cases we see that, one, there is no consideration for age, etc., and it is not restriction but total prohibition. Secondly, it's not just the what is considered to be cow and considered to be sacred by a section of the Hindus, but all forms of bovine are to be prohibited from ending up in from being slaughtered. And at the same time, it also allows private citizens, particularly the Haryana Act, allows the private citizens to act as vigilantes and get some official status as such. The Gaurakshaks, who were till now being accused of attacking and and being
Violating
involved
the
in
law.
violent acts, also killing people and lynching, etc., but they now have got an official status in some form by being acknowledged and their role being praised by the government as such, and the law itself praises their role. So that is an interesting turn which we see, and that is why I'm arguing that there is a continuity, but at the same time there's a big departure from 2014 onwards.
And an evolution, so as to
Yes,
say.
yes.
While you touched upon it, I do want to emphasize this question. You've written this in the book, and I found it to be a very pertinent point. That especially in the context of the cow being sacred and the various anti-consumption laws that we have, or the prohibition of slaughter acts that we have, there was a sense of departure of neutrality of the judiciary in terms of what we can consider to be a Hindu majority population who are cattle rearers versus a Muslim majority population who primarily trade the cattle for their flesh. So, do you argue or do you believe this to be true, that the judiciary favored one community over the other because of what you said to be the status quo?
If you examine the career of this law and how it has been again and again changed and amended, what is interesting is that in the fresh attempt, the Gujarat law, which tried to go for total ban, and also this whole thing about consumption and trade was now merged. It was no longer separated as such. Consumption earlier was not a punishable offense. Trade could have been, or slaughter actually was. Now, interestingly, this first attempt that the Gujarat government makes to change this law and make it more stringent, it doesn't get support from the High Court, if I remember it correctly.
Right.
But when a whole, but then it moves to the Supreme Court and it gets a sanction from the Supreme Court. There is definitely how our judicial system is not out of this whole thing about how the national public itself moves or its ideological orientations. The galvanization of the national public in one direction with the emergence of this new Hindutva has impacted every section of the state, including also the judiciary. And it is evident in many pronouncements of it. This is also one of them.
In the current political climate, where the state is very closely aligned with the Hindutva project, do you think that the sanctity or the sacred nature of the cow is not as important as it is to portray an anti-Muslim stance? Because the sort of export of cow meat that we have in India is enormous, and it is not just sanctioned by the state but also in a way approved, which by the way was, as you also mentioned in the book, it was also a very key issue that our current Prime Minister raised during his campaign in 2014.
Yes.
But even after 10 years of that and a seemingly third term, there are no steps taken to stop the export, but there are steps taken and escalated to stop the production of such slaughter, or for lack of a better word, for the consumption of this in India. So do you think there is a hypocrisy and a very clear state-sponsored anti-Muslim stance?
So, which is very interesting that I observed that this whole exercise of cow, protection is little about protection. You rightly mentioned that while the export and the trade is taking place, when questioned, they say that it is buffalo meat and now cow meat which they are allowing. That's another case altogether. But at the same time, look at whether the population, cattle population, has increased since these laws have come in place. In fact, there is a data produced by some people who show that the population of the cow has declined, and therefore no thought was given to it. Because you're right, that cow protection was not what the whole thing was about, but it was about to use it as a means and mechanisms to produce hate and continuously feed this whole business of hate which had emerged, and around which a certain kind of public was being created constantly. It has served them electorally, of course, but when it comes to the question of protecting the cow, there it actually has failed. And besides, there's also now a distinction made between the cow of the, cow belt,
Yeah.
which is the Indo-Gangetic plain, and cows outside of it. It has been said that only cows which are of Indian Indo-Gangetic belt are
Treated
sacred
as
and
mothers.
worshipped.
Yeah.
The foreign breed cows can be slaughtered, and also the cow which are there in the northeast and other parts.
So I'm glad that you mentioned the part about hate, and this will actually lead me to the next chapter of your book, as well as the next questions that I have. The hate-filled communal violence that we've witnessed all across our country, all across our history, and the mention of the case that you already took of the Bhagalpur riots. Now, you in your book say that there are three ways that we can study communal violence. One of them is through nationalist historiographies, one of them is through subaltern historiographies, and one is through Marxist historiographies. Can you explain what are the differences that you observe while you study each of these?
The nationalist historiography was largely interested in understanding communal violence in opposition to the rise of nationalism. So, if you look at the works of Bipin Chandra and his followers, the main historians of the nationalist camp, the whole argument is that communalism emerged as a policy of the British government, of the British colonialists, what is called the divided emperor, the divide and rule. And this we have been fed in our NCERT textbooks, and that's how we have always thought that what communalism is all about. To a certain extent, okay, if we can understand, there have been certain acts of the government, colonial government, such as the separate electorate and etc., where it seemed to have favored one community over the other, and which might have led to further distance between them, building of emergence of communal boundaries, etc. But what explains then the persistence of riots, even in a more virulent form, post-independence? So there is something lacking in our theoretical understanding of violence earlier. Besides, I also noticed that post-violence post-independence riot scholarship is there, although it's not too much, but it's there, it's present from different perspectives. You rightly mentioned the political economy perspective, which the Marxists applied, or there are also subaltern historians who have used ethnicities, caste, and those kinds of identities to understand and explain violence. But while the colonial state was under the this kind of a investigative lens of these theorists, the post-colonial state has never
Has
been.
not been.
And hence the whole thing which I've been mentioning and repeating thoroughly frequently is about this, how the state itself makes the whole business of communities and otherization, including impunity, including letting violence to continue in some situations and not continue in other situations too. So the existing work on violence, I will not say that they are not important. They are of course important. They enlighten us in various ways. But at the same time, their theoretical focus has been more within what is happening within the communities, and now how it is happening because of a certain kind of interaction with the state and different classes of citizens.
So, in order to conclude, and I'm going to use your own words to conclude here. So, the way certain historians have studied communal violence in the colonial era, they did view of the state as a potential actor in the violence. But post-colonial or in the independent era, while we study or while historians have tried to study communal violence per se, they have focused it on the two communities or two or more communities that
Yeah.
might have been
Right.
at odds with each other. But the state has been, in your words, exonerated from all complicity. So when we see this phenomena of the state being exonerated from all complicity, I will come back to the issue of the process of production of official truth that you raised, especially with regards to the Bhagalpur riots or the violence. In the Bhagalpur riots or violence, also there were instances of police bias in excess, and the police also directly acting in the violence itself. We have seen similar things happen in Delhi very recently during 2020, during the Delhi pogrom, where we have videos of the police acting against Muslims at the margins. We have videos of the police being in cohort with the Hindutva mobs. And therefore, from then onwards, to the point where Muslim activists were being charged with terror laws such as the UAPA, where the Delhi police had constructed a whole different narrative, which was utilized by the mainstream media as part of the official truth. Do you think that the production of official truth is a phenomena that has now been perfected by the state, especially to be used against Muslims on the margins?
Yeah. So it is not only against the Muslims. Here, of course, I have been trying to study how Muslims emerge in this situation. But you're right in various ways that Bhagalpur only is, you can say, a sample. It could have been case of an extreme case as such. But then when we observe and study other instances of mass violence in India, we see almost a similar kind of a mechanism at work. In the case of Bhagalpur, there was one commission of inquiry with two different reports, which gave me space to understand it more in a crude fashion, in that sense, to see it very, very clearly and explicitly that how the truths were which the state was producing, well, it deliberately, in some sense, was ending up making creating confusion all around about the perpetrators, about the victims, etc. Now, in other cases, even if the commissions of inquiry have been there and they have come out with reports, and sometimes those reports have been also accepted by the victims as closer to their own truths, but there have hardly ever been any follow-up, and the same instance of violence have been studied or investigated by multiple commissions too, each of them coming up with different kinds of reports again. The Gujarat violence, you see, we have Banerjee Commission report telling us that the Godhra train, this burning was basically an accidental thing. There are other commission which would say that no, it was a design, it was deliberately done by the Godhra Muslim residents. So all kinds of things which come up, and ultimately they all end up resulting in virtually no action. I don't think that the Delhi riots have been actually any commission of inquiry has been instituted to investigate it.
No, not a commission of inquiry. The police inquiry is going
The
on.
police inquiry, of course. So that is the difference which we see from the past. So while there you have a state which stood more or less as a bystander, or at times also as a partisan in the enactment of violence. But at the same time, from profane, it also wished to also revive its sublime image, and therefore institute a commission of inquiry so that the victims continue to have some hope in the state. This state 2014 onwards, the new ideological orientation which it has adopted is not bothered about it. It is actually, it wants to send a message to the majority that the state works for you.
So I'm very glad that you raised this point of how the state recently has become so immune to perceptions of being unjust or biased that it wants to have a sense of impunity. It wants people to perceive it to have a sense of impunity. My question to you is, until the recent past, the state enjoyed a sense of impunity because it had support from the majority. Do you now think that the majority is also having a sense of impunity because it has support from the state? As we see in the cases of mob lynchings, as we see in the cases of various kind of harassment that we see on the street, and also as we see in the case of how any sort of action taken by somebody affiliated to the Hindutva project almost is granted bail in the next week or month or so. So what do you think about that?
Broader argument which I'm trying to make within that, the post 2014 onwards, what we are seeing is that what was not endorsed earlier publicly is now being encouraged, rather, to the extent of even being awarded, or rewarded or glorified. So those who are accused of mob lynching, not only that the entire justice mechanism, law enforcing mechanism behaves entirely in support, comes out in supportive role. Very often we have seen in Rajasthan, and we've seen it in Jharkhand, we've seen it in other places too. But at the same time, there is whole glorification about that exercise. That it's no longer that somehow you are able to escape the law, but in fact now your act is being endorsed, that it is being rewarded, that you've been turned into a hero, a Hindutva hero in that sense. And therefore, the remarkable thing which has happened post 2014 is, if you see even in terms of data, the India Spends data is there on mob lynching, and it says that how it has increased multiple times since 2014, and most often the targets are the victims are Muslims or also Dalits and the tribes. This has increased manifold post 2014, and one should think about why has it happened so. Because except for the political leadership, nothing else should have changed. But what has actually changed is that the whole idea about how there are certain classes of people who are dispensable, that who in some sense are citizens, but they don't deserve to be citizens.
So I'm glad that you mentioned that this seems to be a process of making Muslims, or making a certain section of society, including Muslims, second-class citizens. But in your own book, this phenomena was not something, and I'm sure you're also not saying that it started in 2014. It was amplified in 2014. But when we look at the Indian state's treatment of the Muslims as a community, we see that the process of treating them differently has not been recent, and in fact it goes very long back. In your own book, you have written about the 1950s government order that excluded Muslims and Christians. So do you think from then on, from that government order and throughout, there has been a certain bias of the Indian nation state against Muslims and other marginalized communities?
Yeah, I won't say that it hasn't existed in practice as well as in pronouncements too. And 1950 presidential order is one such case. Now, it also has a certain history to it. One is the context of partition. You see, in the Constituent Assembly, Not only were the Muslim low caste denied the scheduled, Muslim and Christian low caste denied the scheduled caste status, also whatever certain kind of protections which minorities as such had was to a large extent taken away from them. The draft constitution and the final constitution on the minority question is completely different. Now, the minority then, in the current context, and from the constitutional scheme, you'll see, is largely only a cultural community, is a cultural collective which has only cultural needs such as protections, language, religion, etc. Whereas what we see, and such a committee, of course, has provided us data in that sense, it shows that it lives largely on the margins, particularly in much of North and Eastern India. In Southern India, with the development indices of the Southern Indian states being better, the Muslim situation is also better compared to the Muslims of the North and the Eastern India. But wherever large populations of Muslims are there, Assam, Bengal, Bihar, UP, is huge poverty. Now, despite this, you see that affirmative action policies have either have not effectively reached them. I can say that. Say, for example, in OBC reservation, a good number of Muslim castes have been extended the benefits of reservation. But at the same time, in practice, it is very difficult for them to get OBC certificates. Many groups of them have still not been included in the OBC list. I'm not talking about the upper castes, but amongst the middle castes as well as the lower castes, we had identified, when I was with such a committee, at least 30 different communities within UP itself, which had not been given the status of OBC despite being, by all parameters, a backward caste or backward community from amongst Muslims. In the same extent, you will see that how the presidential order makes this distinction between different classes of citizens. Interestingly, I look at the court pronouncements too and court judgments too. The courts have actually allowed Ghar Vapsi, this whole the right-wing campaign of Ghar Vapsi. The court facilitates it. It allows, in KP Manu case from Kerala, it allows, even if many generations earlier, your ancestors had converted into Christianity, but now, if you wish to come back to the Hindu caste, which is listed in the scheduled caste, you will get the scheduled caste status. It actually invites now a reconversion and
judicial Ghar Vapsi.
It's a judicial Ghar Vapsi. So in that sense, you are right that the way in which we have shifts in the ideological orientation of Indian nationalist ideology, it has its impacts on various different institutions.
I'm glad you mentioned the judiciary as well in the last answer, because there is a chapter in your book which is talking about how a mosque or any religious place of worship may or may not be treated as a juristic person. Now, we saw in the case of Babri Masjid and the Ram Janmabhoomi issue that there was a juristic person assumed to be in the case. And we also see, and it has been written multiple times, that the bias of the state towards the sentiments of the people rather than judicial principles, as well as the bias of the state towards the majority opinion versus, following the tenets of truth or justice, were what drove the decision in the case. It was, to quote the book, it was not surprising. So, can you tell us how important was that particular juncture on how the Muslims at the margins saw the state and how the state extended its limits as to what it could do in terms of its practices of violence against Muslims after that decision.
The Babri judgment, came as a shock to many people who expected that some amount of justness would prevail, because what the order says is that one doesn't know whether there was a temple which was demolished to make a mosque, which is the Hindu rights case. So that case was also not accepted. Secondly, it also said that that the demolition took place and it is a criminal act. Demolition of the mosque, which means there was a mosque which existed. At the same time, it says that the namaz was not taking place there for a long period of time. But there is a reason and history to it, that it was stopped following skirmish and violence in which many people were killed in the colonial times. In fact, there was and the lock was surreptitiously opened and an idol established after independence with the connivance of the district magistrate, Nair, I think, of that time, and the local court. So, being aware of everything and being also recording it, most of it, in the judgment too, still, when you read the judgment and then the final decision comes, it is entirely different. It does not even try to behave like the Allahabad court judgment was called to be a panchayati judgment, in which it gave a bit to everyone.
All three parties.
But here it was completely handed over in one direction. So in that sense, it endorses, despite it saying that demolition was wrong, but it endorses it, which was a criminal act, and which case is still on. Anyways, this chapter is actually on an incident which happened in the colonial time, which is Shahid Ganj Mosque. Shahid Ganj Gurudwara came into existence during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's rule, which was earlier a mosque, and it was in public memory. Everyone knew about it. When Ranjit Singh's rule ended and the Britishers came, the Muslim organizations approached the government saying that this should be restored to us. But the Sikhs also had a reason that, according to their own belief, that some of the Sikh holy men had been, martyred in that place, and that's why the name Shahid Ganj. And therefore, there is some sacredness associated with it, and they had already built a Gurudwara too, and hence they should retain that. And as I said, that the colonial state's first usual response was that although it would go into the merit of the case, etc., but ultimately you would say that the restoration of public order meant maintenance of status quo. So the same thing it followed in the case of the cow slaughter question, as well as in this case, and there were other such disputed structures too. In all of those cases, through Land Alienation Act or all those kinds of enactments which were there, they tried to insist that whoever is in the possession shall remain in possession. So from there, and if we compare it with what the whole history of judicial pronouncements in the case of the Ayodhya, it is a completely different kind of a track it takes. It is a whole story of might is right, ultimately, which comes to be endorsed by the state. The public order is not the question now for the state as such. The justness also is abandoned altogether. The rationality and modern law and the judicial principles, case history, and all that through which we arrive at it is not what matters. But ultimately, there is an arbitrary kind of a handing over to the majoritarian sentiments altogether. So that is also tells the story of the state and how it has its ideological orientations have shifted over a period of time.
Thank you for giving us a brief overview of the juristic person and the judicial history about it. Now, all of this seems to be a very grim documentation of the nation state, especially vis-a-vis the nation state's interaction with Muslims. In light of this, in light of these many cases that we've discussed, the examples, the events, there is a certain sense of lack of trust that Muslim citizens have with respect to the nation state. You see them being lynched and the judiciary does not do anything. You see their houses being razed and there is some sort of retrospective legal approval that is provided or legal justification that is provided for their houses being razed. You see them being hounded by the state itself, and there seems to be no trial even in sight. For example, in the case of Umar Khalid or Shazil Imam or Khalid Saifi, even a trial is not being granted to them. So when we see such cases happening in front of our eyes, there is a sense of despondency that develops, and there is also a lack of trust. How dangerous do you think that is for the Muslims and for the Indian nation state? And how do you think this can be dealt with by the Muslims and by the Indian nation state?
So, for the Muslims as such and many other marginal groups today, it is a trying time, it is a difficult time. Because if you see leave aside how the state addresses the Muslim question, which is very evident now. In fact, its entire politics and ideology is built on isolating them. But the way in which it responds to, say, the farmers, the women and the women boxers who came, the women athletes who were wrestlers and their question, or to any class of citizen which sees itself as being pushed to the corner, the state is not coming around in support of them, extending a certain kind of a helping hand, but rather what we see that it comes out with full force on them, most often on behalf of those who are the oppressors. So it is a difficult time for people of India, for Muslims included. Maybe Muslims may face it more than others, but it also depends on different contexts in which it is there, in which the politics operates. But what I would say is that the most important thing, what we have to bear in mind is that change is a reality. That whatever has existed has not existed perpetually as such. And through certain, considered, rational, organized way of acting, one can actually play a role of a catalyst in this change. So the hope in politics should be kept alive, that constant participation in politics, in furthering its agenda, in ensuring that the political process itself does not exclude Muslims altogether or any marginal community, that their hopes and aspirations are recorded and politics takes it as a central question. That is important. I still think that Muslims are not alienated. They may not have trust in this government, or they might have lost trust in various because of the actions of the government itself. But they are not alienated in the sense, if they were alienated, they would not have come out and voted in such huge numbers. They remain hopeful. In fact, if you see the recent election results, it only attests to the fact that different sections of the population do see hope in politics. And when they are facing the brunt, they have the potential to organize themselves and take a certain kind of rational move. So we'll see that the shifts which have taken place recently in the recent elections, the It is because marginal groups have, come out and, have actually given strength to the oppositional politics.
But how long do you think that can continue? Because, yes, we saw that the marginalized groups were very hopeful and very proactive in these general elections, and there came a result that led to a lot of celebration, if I may say so, but at least a lot of relief among marginalized communities in India. But 15 days after the general election results have been announced, today's the 16th day, if I'm not wrong. 4 lynchings have already taken place. So it is true that we must anticipate and hope for change, but there seems to be very little evidence to show for it.
You're right that if we look at the formation of the ministries, that way in which some of the action of the state following elections which have taken place, they are suggest as if that nothing has changed, that the old story continues to be repeated, same people will continue to suffer. While this cannot be denied, but at the same time, the fact that this is going beyond the book, that 2 myths, of course, have been busted. One is the myth of invincibility, which was being served to us constantly. Aega to. So that myth definitely has been busted. There is a possibility that there are large sections of population, and it is not just Muslims who are upset with you, but large sections of other people as well do not accept you. So that is one myth which has been busted. The second myth which has been definitely busted is this whole business of making election predictions and trying to, again, it also served it to strengthen this whole idea of invincibility. So that too now completely is shattered. And while it might be a period of even more, darkness, because for them they might also see it as a last phase of the rule or the regime, and the regime might come back with more aggression or something. But nevertheless, there are certain positives which can also see. I think I see that there is a possibility now.
I hope you're right, and I hope we get to see much more positives. Thank you so much, Professor Fazal, for giving us your time and your opinions and your wisdom. Thank you for this interview.
Thank you.